Okay, so let's continue on our discussion and look at some of the common themes that are prevalent in the literature that we're going to be studying this term. So one of the major themes or threads that ties together the literature that we're studying is this idea of war as a kind of proving ground. So this idea is basically suggesting that war is used by the soldiers as a way to prove their self-worth. And it's kind of a test or a trial where they overcome obstacles and achieve a kind of greatness or honor or value, status, if they're able to prove themselves as war heroes. On the flip side of that, you could not prove yourself and not, I guess, fail at this test. So that is also sort of one of the risks or consequences that a soldier might face. Maybe they go in believing that they're going to be an accomplished war hero, they're going to have medals, and they read stories about being a military hero, and they want to prove that they're as good as maybe their father or their uncle or somebody they wanted to emulate, and they didn't meet that standard or they didn't meet that ideal. So the proving ground is the battlefield, and what's at stake is sort of your reputation, your sense of self-respect, and the way that others view you as well. So if you are, we don't really consider it as important now, but becoming a war hero, earning your badges, this was sort of almost like a position of great authority and esteem in society. You know, your name would be in the paper, you would be written about and talked about in your community, would, you know, have a parade, and you would be, again, almost like a role model for others if you achieved, you know, military valor on the battlefield. But so this was a chance for boys to prove themselves and become men on the battlefield. For a woman entering the war, this is sort of not what we're dealing with in the book, but war could also be a kind of proving ground as well, sort of proving that you're strong enough or as able as male soldiers to succeed or prove yourself on the battlefield as well. So this idea will be prevalent in the literature that we're reading. And it's also tied with gender. So we'll see that as well surface, where we have ideas of manhood and masculinity, and how war becomes a kind of means or way to prove one's manhood or masculinity as well. Next theme is initiation and maturation, otherwise known as a kind of coming of age. So this is a theme or idea that's present in a lot of the literature that we'll be studying. So basically we see a kind of transformation in terms of some of the characters as they sort of start out maybe a little bit more innocent, not, you know, they lack a kind of knowledge of the world, lack experience, sort of naive. And then the initiation is the war itself, which sort of is a rite of passage, and it changes them, right? So we see a kind of transformation of that character as they go from innocent to more experienced of the world. They go from innocence to a kind of knowledge or adult maturation. So they're going from boy to man, or, you know, from naive to more experienced. And this is sort of achieved through the war, right? So coming of age at a time when war is going on all around you. And this is a theme or idea that we can all relate to, having sort of gone through that transition from child to adult, and the rites of passages for many generations has been going and serving your country, going to war. So that was part of the process. So you turn 18, and you enter or enlist, right? Or you were forced to enlist. So this rite of passage has been sort of part or connected to the battle, war, in different ways. Another theme or idea, this theme of self versus the other. So this is an interesting sort of idea, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but if when you think about a battle, a war, there's always this kind of us versus them situation where you have, your country versus another country, or your nation versus another nation, the good guys versus the bad guys. So it's always a division in that way. Very often it was also could be sort of divided between gender as well. So you had men serving their country while the women stayed at home. So there was also kind of gender divide, as well as a sort of ethnic or racial divide in some cases, or a national, different nation groups. So we have this sort of conflict or divisions that exist. And the other is always, the person who, or the group that we measure ourselves against. So in a military scenario, you always want to believe that you're fighting on the side of the good, the righteous, and then the other is the wrong one. They're the bad person, they're evil, or they're the other that has to be destroyed, or we have to defend ourselves against them. So there's always this division, and sometimes that line starts to break down, and you start seeing the other as not so different from yourself. And this really is something that we'll look for in the book, in the text as well, where that self versus other divide becomes a lot more blurry, or a conflict of it's no longer a sort of black and white situation, but there is sort of shades of gray between this division. Manhood will be another theme, so defining manhood. How is that idea of masculinity portrayed in the texts? Does the text sort of challenge stereotypical visions or idealized visions of masculinity and manhood? Or does it sort of reinforce them? How are the characters sort of stuck or caught up in norms of masculinity and manhood? So these will be some of the themes that we'll see in the texts that we're studying, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a couple of more lectures. But this idea of masculinity and manhood will be sort of an overarching theme or idea of the course. Disillusionment and conflict is another central theme. And we'll see how, we've already sort of talked about this a little bit, but there are certain myths or ideas about being a soldier that exist, such as, that it's a sweet and righteous thing to do, to die for one's country. We saw how Wilfred Owen sort of said that this is a lie, right? It's used almost like propaganda to get young men to enlist and serve their country, but really there's nothing except for horror and suffering on the battlegrounds, and that's the reality. So there's this moment of disillusionment and conflict that is prevalent in the lives of many of the characters, and we'll see that disillusionment, so how they come to terms with the realities of what they're facing. And there's a lot of conflict, right? Self-conflict. You're in this role as a soldier, you have certain duties and obligations, and at the same time you feel conflicted about your involvement in the war, why you're there, if it actually is a noble cause, or whether you're just creating havoc. So there's all these sort of conflicts that are involved in the texts that we'll identify. And then finally, the theme of trauma and its after effects. So how do these characters deal with traumatic events in their lives, seeing, friends and fellow soldiers or loved ones' lives be destroyed, and how one deals with that, the effects of that traumatic event long after that event is over. So we'll take a look more closely at sort of the psychological aspects of serving as a soldier, issues related to post-traumatic stress disorder, and that soldier's experience of dealing with traumatic events. Okay, so these are some common themes. Keep them in mind when you're reading, and think back to them when you're, writing your essays as well. So we'll talk about these topics repeatedly in our lectures. So in our class discussions and through the forums, I'm really sort of hoping that we learn to sort of adopt a way of interpreting the text through a kind of critical lens. And in the forums, I asked you guys to sort of find examples in the text related to topics of gender or masculinity, trauma, and race or ethnicity. And these are really my way of sort of integrating critical lenses into the course material. And then I'm going to go more closely into some key terms, vocabulary for each of these critical lenses, just to get you guys familiar, if you're not already, with some ideas or background into each way or interpretive lens. So the feminist gender lens is really looking specifically at masculinity and femininity, the representations of gender. You'd also be looking for a sort of inequality, so are men and women treated equally or have equal power or social privileges in the text? Or you might ask yourself, who has more power or social status? So we'll be looking at gender throughout. You might look for stereotypes of gender. So how are the men portrayed as really macho, or do they challenge those stereotypes? That type of thing. So I'll have you guys look for, if you see anything interesting in the text related to gender, I would say, underline it, highlight it, put a star beside it, and then maybe incorporate that into your forum discussion. And then we have psychoanalytic, or the trauma lens. So trauma specifically is going to be a big part of our discussion, how past events still sort of have a hold on one's mind long after that event is over. So how something traumatic can happen to somebody, say during the war, and then how years later that event can still sort of haunt them or trouble them. So this will be also could be incorporated into your forum discussions. So if you find evidence of a sort of psychological disturbance in a character, you could maybe make note of that. If you think they're struggling with something traumatic, comment on that or put a star beside that. So anything that you feel is sort of important in regards to their mental health state, that could be included in this critical interpretation. And then finally, race or ethnicity could also be sort of on your radar. So if you can find examples in the text where there are depictions of racial or ethnic diversity, if there is any sort of inequalities based on race or ethnicity in the text, is somebody being discriminated against, or is there prejudice, or is that character at a disadvantage based on their race or ethnicity? So you can also pay attention to that. So this is sometimes called the post-colonialist lens, and it's looking for sort of inequalities based on race or ethnicity. You could also look for stereotypes, or whether you think the text is sort of challenging or reinforcing ethnic or racial stereotypes. So